Hi, welcome to the Frontline Leadership Podcast. And on today's show, we'll be talking to Nicole Weyer. Let's run the intro. Hi, Nicole. How are you?
Hi, David. Good afternoon. I am well. I'm so excited to be here with you today. Thanks for the invitation.
Me too. Thank you for agreeing to come on. This is fantastic. So, Nicole, tell us a little bit about yourself. People would rather hear your voice than mine, I'm sure. So, tell us what you do, where you are, and that kind of stuff.
I would love to do that. I am currently in Oregon on the west coast of the United States. I moved across the country last summer in the middle of COVID. Not so sure I would recommend a cross-country move in the middle of a pandemic, but it was an adventure. My first career was in education. I worked in independent schools and in higher ed for over 20 years, sat around the leadership table at various institutions. And then in 2018, I walked out of the dean's office into the world of coaching and consulting and entrepreneurship because I want to transform schools from the inside out and go in and really take a deep dive with leadership teams of organizations and help them shift from a place of unhealthy cultures and burnout and depletion into a place where everyone is energized and thriving.
Well, that sounds good. I'm just going to jump straight in here because I'm curious about leadership in education, Nicole. Like, I wouldn't necessarily say education, but in a past life, I'll try not to talk about me too much. But I used to train people, which is kind of education, like train adults, like in technical subjects,
Right.
In like this, like a trade school type of place, you could call it. So it was like my experience of leadership in that environment was, I think it was like, it's not traditional education because they're guys from the production floor, the factory floor. So am I. I'm trying to help them. We get in our hands dirty still. We had a little workshop where we used to take them. And so it's a little bit different. So what is leadership? I try and describe leadership in education to me. It's kind of a mystery to me. I mean, I see my kids' teachers over the years, and it's just a lot different to the world I've lived in.
I think it's in some ways it's different. And honestly, I feel like there's a really good amount of crossover as well. I started out being a live-in faculty member. So I started out teaching at the college level and hadn't really planned on having a career in that part of education. But I started teaching and doing student affairs work. And what I realized is that there were a couple things that I really loved. One of them was literally walking alongside my students as they were learning and growing and struggling and succeeding and just kind of falling forward and face planting. And what I realized is that my main role was to believe in them until they could believe in themselves. So if that meant building a skill, I just knew and continued to tell them that they were fully capable and that they could do it and we were going to do it together. And that was actually the beginning of my coaching career. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was coaching as well as leading. And then I had an opportunity to step into an administrative position at an independent school in New Hampshire and be part of the leadership team of the school. So I had a whole team of 25 people that I was leading and guiding. And they were responsible for kind of students beyond the classroom. And so there's definitely different kinds of leadership structures. It is definitely about mentoring and support and accountability and doing exactly what you said in terms of like, is there a skill that we need to learn? And walking alongside them and working with them to build that skill, whether or not it's about problem solving and diffusing student conflicts, whether or not it's about helping students figure out how to meet deadlines, whether or not it's about helping them as faculty members learn how to meet deadlines. So it's similar in the sense of you're just working alongside people. And
Right.
it doesn't mean that I have all the answers, because I didn't, but it meant that we were in it together because we were working towards a bigger mission and a bigger purpose.
Yeah, it does. Like, as you describe that, it sounds actually just like the world that I've lived in. So there you go. There's my, you've put that to bed for me. So, I've heard you talk, about, like, leadership. We've all got our blind spots, right? I believe. And I've heard you talk about that subject matter.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like you to, let's go there, Nicole, if you don't mind. Let's talk about blind spots and what do you mean by that, and let's dig in.
I would love to dig into that, because I 100% agree with you. As human beings, every single one of us has blind spots, and sometimes we have some degree of awareness that they're there, and sometimes they are so deep, the depth and breadth is so significant that we have absolutely no idea.
Right.
I think for me, in an educational setting, one of the things that I started to realize, not only in myself, but in my administrative colleagues, is the power of the quality of our presence. And what I mean by that is, we were, especially in a school setting, it's like living in a fishbowl, right? Because students constantly observing us when we know that they are and when we think they are not. And faculty and staff are always looking to us to see, how do we respond? What gets us flustered? Yep. When are we calm? How are we problem solving? And I think one of the biggest blind spots, specifically for school leaders, but I have seen it in the corporate world and in nonprofit boards as well, is we can really forget about the quality of our presence. And what I mean is, when we walk into a meeting and we are flustered and we start by saying, I'm so busy, and we set the tone of the meeting by being flustered and really busy and overscheduled.
Okay.
When we are attending commitments, even when we're not leading a meeting, and when we're on our phone, when we're not fully present to what we are attending to. It can also be as simple, and I started to see this at one of the schools that I served. The president of the institution loved to send emails at like 2:00 in the morning. And I had this moment and I remember distinctly seeing him in the parking lot one morning at about 8, and he said to me, "Did you get my message?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And I went to my office and I looked at it, and I had this moment of, "You sent it to me at 2:30 a.m. First of all, I wasn't up. And second of all, if I was up, I was not on my email." And how we manage our time, how we show up in meetings, it all sets the tone and influences the culture, because it tells everyone else what it takes to be a leader.
Right.
To be a leader, do you have to be working all the time? Do you have to be, the first one in and the last one out?
Right.
You need to be sending an email at 2:30 a.m.
Right.
And we forget the messages that sends to everyone else, in terms of, if I want to be successful, this is what I have to do.
Right.
So as leaders, we end up shaping and introducing all of these core values into an institution that we don't want. Workaholism, burnout, working all the time, an inability to say no, martyrdom, and self-sacrifice. And then we sit around the same table and wonder why people are unhappy and they don't stay, and we can't recruit talent. So it's this complicated equation. And yet when we peel back the layers, it can be really simple. And I just gave you a whole lot to say, a whole lot to think about.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because in the kind of manufacturing world, actually, I'm not going to name any names, but they know who they are. I had a new leader sort of in the last 12 to 18 months. And they were there at 5 a.m.
Yeah.
And they didn't leave till 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. then they were there at 4 a.m. on a Saturday morning when the night shift people, the overnight people were, and that's okay. I mean, they were getting to know the business. They were getting to know the people. But you saw people change. You saw people's behavior change. When they'd already done 9 hours or 10 hours, let's say, or even 8 hours, and they hadn't had a lunch break yet, and they hadn't.
Right.
I'm talking about other supervisors, other lead, different layers of leadership. You could see them starting to like second guess their self.
Yeah.
Should I leave? Like it's time to change the shift handover from one group of people to the next. You could see people just like hanging about, even people who are not supervisors, like just the people that actually did the work. So it does change them. It does change them. It's interesting you say that. I've seen a lot of that over the years. People, first in the building, last out of the building, and just going and going. It does set a tone, right? It sets. Can be unhealthy. It can be unhealthy.
And I think another outcome is we can be shaping the culture of our organization in a way that we never intended.
Right.
And it really takes someone to be self-reflective, to be able to be courageous enough to look in the mirror and say, do I have a role in some of the things that my organization is faced with? Do I have a role in creating some of those challenges, even though I didn't mean to? Because if we are setting those unwritten expectations that do not show up in a job description, they're not other duties as assigned, but they're these tricky little expectations of you come in and you stay late and you don't take a break, and people show up when they're sick and they don't take sick time, or they don't take vacation time, or they're constantly just picking up shifts and covering, and there's no moment for a leader in whatever role they're in to say, it's okay to say no. Like, it's okay for someone else to cover. Because, I mean, what do we want to do as human beings? We want to be accepted. We want to be liked. We want to feel like we're connected and we're part of something. So we can do these things that we know don't help us. Yeah. But in the larger context, it's so hard to say no and to be that person who's kind of the outlier who says, it's shift change. I'm actually going to, not just quietly trying to sort of skulk out the door, but be able to say, see you guys tomorrow. Like that's tough.
Right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's interesting. And also I've kind of avoided this somehow over the years in the different levels, but I've known a lot of people that like they will log into, for instance, there's this, like a piece of software that the manufacturing floor uses, which monitors like output and efficiencies and stuff like that.
Sure.
You can see when machines were down and all that kind of interesting stuff. But some of these people were logging in from home, like on like Saturday morning, Friday at 2:00 in the morning, like you just described, and then calling in saying, "Oh, what's wrong with machine number 10?" And it's like, what? and it's like, I've seen that too. So that's them kind of just, they just don't seem to know where the boundary is. They don't know where to, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what looks good, what doesn't. So how does somebody reset in your experience, Nicole? So let's say I've been teaching all day or I've been working in my manufacturing environment and I really have had enough. Like I'm starting to feel it, right? Because you can't sustain that kind of performance. Like you just can't do that. So maybe you could talk around how people try and step back from that without kind of, because I know people would be concerned that that's going to be noticed, right? And that's like a negative thing. So in your experience, how do we, because what we're trying to do here, Nicole, on this podcast is trying to give people some kind of practical things that they can, like, they'll resonate with, and then go, yeah, shit, I can try that. I can do that.
Yeah.
So how would you tackle that? Somebody came to you and they were like burning out. They were just exhausted. What would you tell them?
Mm-hmm. The first thing that I would tell them is honestly how courageous they are to actually admit how they're feeling and admit what they're experiencing, because I've been there and it was really hard for me to look in the mirror and for me to say to another person, I am exhausted.
Right.
I am not happy. I thought this is what I wanted. I'm now in it. And now I have all these big questions about, do I stay? Do I go? What does that mean? So whenever any of my clients or people that I know arrive at that place, the first thing to do truthfully is just to acknowledge and celebrate that they're there and that they're at a place where they actually want to have a conversation. One of the things that I will say is getting to that place of just burnout and exhaustion and feeling isolated and depleted doesn't happen overnight. And it's this really complicated, pretty sophisticated equation.
Right.
And so the first step is acknowledging where you are. And then part of the work really goes in a couple different directions. One of them really focuses on holistic health in terms of starting to look at sleep and adventure and play and joy and activities that can be restorative, and to make sure that those are part of your day or at least show up a few times a week. Because if we are always living to work, we are going to be empty. So one of the first things that people can do is, if you can on a daily basis, do one thing that you love, 10, 15 minutes. It could be singing a song. It could be standing out in the rain. It could be dancing with your child. It could be, an embrace with your spouse. It could be reading a book. It could be the funniest YouTube video that is completely insane that you watch every time and you cannot help but laugh.
Right.
So bringing in one thing every day that is just light and happy and joyful starts to begin the restoration process. You also kind of mentioned boundaries, and that is so much of the work. It's figuring out, how do we say yes, and what do we say yes to, and what do we say no to? And we can say no without disappointing other people, and we can say no and really look at and change some of our boundaries and still be the dependable teammate, the fantastic employee, the go-to person, and the problem solver. But we need to untangle some of that thinking in our mind about good employee means running myself ragged.
Right.
So there's a lot of work that happens around boundaries, and a lot of it is actually learning how to just decline invitations and learning how to say no. That was a long process for me, but it is one that is completely worthwhile. What I will also say is the leadership opportunity for anyone in any kind of a leadership position is to really tune into their team members and to be willing to ask questions of, are you okay? And to be ready to hear an answer that isn't, yes, everything is fine.
Right.
And that can be hard. But we need leaders who are tuned in and who are using those skills that we know that they have and saying, David, it looks like you're having a bad day. Are you okay? Is there anything that I can do? So it's bringing humanity into our workplace and starting to normalize the gamut of emotions that we feel. So a lot of it is our work, but a lot of it is the work of the leaders and the organizations that we serve.
Yeah, it's very interesting that the subject matter that you're talking about, Nicole, and having done a few interviews now with different people from different environments, there's almost every one of them has talked about how important it is to do the things you're talking about, and something that you didn't directly say, but it's kind of obvious. that somebody else said prior was about building relationships.
Yes.
Like, first of all, and it sounds obvious, right? You got to build, like, and I made a comment that nobody wants to be managed. Like, I never wanted to be managed. Like, what does that mean? Manage? You're going to manage me? Like, what does that mean? You know, they would much rather have a relationship. And I know that sounds sounds obvious, but it's not obvious to a lot of leaders. It's not obvious. There's still people out there, I know, because I've been around them fairly recently, who are kind of barking out orders, and and they're not interested that that somebody's mother or somebody's grandmother or somebody's kid, or they've got some stuff going on. They don't know their people. They just don't. That's the thing. They don't know their people. And when they walk into a room, the way you described, could be a meeting, could be somebody throwing the door open to their office. Yes, people are always watching. And how do you build a relationship with somebody that's doing that kind of stuff, right? So it's critical stuff. It really is.
Well, and what you're speaking to, or at least what I'm hearing from that, is my takeaway, having worked for some leaders that kind of fit squarely in what you described, is remember that their behavior isn't about us, right? Their need to rule with an iron fist, their need to control, their need to micromanage is really about their own confidence or lack of confidence, and their own potential fear of doing a good job and fear of their own failure. And it has nothing to do with us. So it's actually a really great takeaway for people. If that's what you're feeling and that's who you are working for, that is the personality, it's really not about you. It is all about them and the relationship that they have with themselves. It doesn't make it easier, but that can create just a little bit of space for us to not take it as personally. And I think, truthfully, there's so much that isn't taught. I mean, if you go to grad school and you get a business degree or a degree in leadership, there's so much that is not taught. And in my mind, one of the biggest lessons from COVID is really putting leadership underneath a microscope and really starting to ask questions about what are the qualities in a leader that we want? What are the qualities of a leader that serve our institution? Because as we look at the Great Resignation, I think what we're seeing is the leaders that you described are not the ones that people want to work for anymore. And for whatever reason, working through a global pandemic has empowered people to say, I have had enough. And for organizations to now struggle with staffing, which means that they also need to figure out, why is this happening to us and not some of our competitors? So there's a learning opportunity for an awful lot of organizations right now to say, who are we? How are we functioning? How are we supporting and engaging our teams? How are we taking care of ourselves? Because if I feel like complete garbage, that's the self that I bring to work. And that's not fair to any of my colleagues.
Right.
It's not fair and it's not appropriate.
It's very interesting. I mean, I don't know whether this is appropriate to talk about this, but I mean, I think it is. Like, if you work for somebody who's doing that, right? Yeah. And when I say work for, it doesn't have to be the owner of the business. It can be your operations manager, it can be your production manager, it can be your principal, it can be whoever it is. Yeah. In your experience, Nicole, when and how do people go about having a conversation with that person? Because you can't, like, I don't go looking for trouble necessarily, Nicole, but I've got a book behind me. I'm not going to get into it too much, but it's called the Professional Troublemaker.
Nice.
And it all started from, you can go and look it up on YouTube. It's really, she's fantastic. The lady that wrote the book. I'm not even going to try and pronounce her name because I'm terrible at stuff like that. But she talked about being the person that when they're in a store, or when they're waiting in line at the bank, and the teller's being incredibly rude to the person and they don't know what to say for themselves. They don't know what to do. That she's always the one that like gets involved. She feels that she needs to get involved. Not in like a confrontational way, like not like that, but just kind of saying to people, are you aware that the way you are being, and the way that you're talking to your clients, and so on. So would you advise people getting into that kind of stuff, like in the education back kind of environment? Like for me in manufacturing, that's not necessarily encouraged. Don't go fighting with somebody, but you've got to have a conversation with them. You've absolutely got to tackle them about this. At some point, you have to do that. There's no, don't rely on. People have said to me in the past, "Oh, I'm just going to leave that to my union rep," or
Right.
it's like no, like you've got to have you've got a relationship with this person. It's okay. You have to have that conversation with them. I just wonder what your thoughts were along those lines. Sorry for laboring that point.
No, I think I agree with you, and I think you hit the nail on the head. It's about working with someone is there's a relationship that's there.
Yeah.
And if we want to honor that relationship, whether or not we love it or don't love it, we have a responsibility to bring ourselves and bring those conversations forward. Are they easy? No. Are they comfortable? Unlikely. Are they important? Because then that person, that team leader, that supervisor, that manager, that owner gets to hear our experience. And when the conversation comes from, this is my experience that we just had in this interaction and it felt really uncomfortable for me. When we're coming from a place of sharing our experience, not at a place of I want to shame or blame or yell at someone, there's an opportunity for growth, and there's an opportunity for listening. So there have definitely been times, I will remember a time very clearly where I needed to have that conversation with the person that I was reporting to, because it just felt like we were communicating and it was a lot of this. And I knew that wasn't what we were about.
Right.
And it took some time, but I needed to sit down and say, the last probably week, it has really felt as though we have been at odds, and I'm trying to figure out how we got there and what's contributing to it, because you and I are a really good team, and we've been a really good team. And right now it feels like we're not. So am I reading this correctly? Are you feeling this too? And they just sort of looked at me and went, yes, it's me too. And we had an opportunity to say, how did we get here? And it was an opportunity for us to say, going forward, when we feel like there's a miscue, let's pop in, shut the door, and go, are we there again earlier? So we don't carry it forward. And I think it's not the easy conversation, but we need to step into the arena of our lives, whether or not it's personal or professional, and have those conversations, because it is our experience. And again, when we come from that place of honesty and this is what I'm experiencing, it's really hard for that to go south and become a confrontation.
Right. Something just popped into my little head when you were talking there, Nicole, and it was not connected to. You could say it's connected to leadership, because it was related to the person who was speaking was talking about relationships. Like your private, your personal relationship, let's say with your husband or your wife, and that you should seriously consider having a conversation before anything goes wrong, like right up front, about how we are going to communicate with each other when the poop hits the fan.
Yeah.
Because people don't do that, right? And then 6 months later, they're in a divorce court. So that was the that's where that came from. It was related to relationships. But as you were talking there, like, there may be one kind of conversation that you were describing, but at that point then, I found that priceless. I took that piece of advice that this relationship expert was given, and I use that in my work, in my private life, but also in my work environment.
Yeah.
At the start, let's agree as a group of leaders, how we are going to talk to, like, if I have to come to you as your manager or I hate that word, as your leader, we are going to have conversations at some point, but you're going to have conversations with me. Let's agree on how we're going to conduct those. So it doesn't turn into a slanging match. It doesn't turn into we don't get our knickers in a bunch and everybody gets excited. So it's that kind of brought that back to me.
Well, and wouldn't it be interesting if that were part of the team building process, right? Yep. Like, wouldn't it be fascinating to watch a leadership team of any kind of an organization as they are coming together or as new members come in? So whether or not they are forming initially or new members come in, whether to include in that process, let's talk about like how we deal with disagreements, how we deal with conflict, how we tend to give feedback, and more importantly, how we want to hear feedback. Because if we lay the foundation, we're investing in the relationship, and we're investing in the relationship on the front side, instead of when we are in a crisis point, when emotions and feelings and experiences and stress and frustration is so amplified that it makes it really challenging to speak. So, I mean, when I was leading teams, one of the things that we talked about was, like, part of my role was to evaluate members of my team. And I would talk about like my philosophy on evaluation, which is, it's not a gotcha. Nobody's in trouble. It's about figuring out where we're really incredibly talented, figuring out the places where we're pretty good, and then identifying those places where we want to grow. And people looked at me and they're like, you're not going to mark me as like unmeeting expectations. And I said, it's not the language that I use. Like, for me, it's about, where do we want to grow? And how do we do that? So I think it's also about us, again, rethinking leadership and figuring out what are we doing that's working, but also being really open and not being insulted when someone says, what about trying this? And if we did this, could it make things better? And I might not be comfortable with it, but me being uncomfortable shouldn't be the reason to not try something. And I feel like that's one of the things that trips up a lot of leaders. They focus on, I want to make sure that I am comfortable and that I am positioned well. Right. When it's not really about us. Like, we're supposed to be serving the organization and empowering our team. So we are the guide, and part of being a guide is being transparent and taking responsibility when we need to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you something else that I found interesting during these conversations I've been having with people. There's a couple of people who are military, have a military background. And I was somewhat surprised, and so were they. And they spoke about that, about when they went into the military when they were young. So they really, other than their parents and their teachers, they didn't really have much experience of leaders, if you understand me. And like, they went into the military and it was like, ugh. Like, there was just this drill sergeant yelling at them. And, but then it wasn't really till they came out of the military that they realized how good the military leaders were at the relationship side of things. Like, they were stunned when they came out into the corporate world, into the private sector, and saw the leadership that was going on there. Right. Because you wouldn't think of your drill sergeant as wanting a relationship with you, right? It's because he's got a job to do. Initially, he's got a job to do. And I found that fascinating and so did they. It was a very interesting conversation.
Well,
very interesting conversation.
It's an interesting blind spot, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
When you're in it and you're having a very specific experience,
Yeah.
we're comprehending and we're taking in what that experience is. And when there's space and time to reflect, and when we see something different, we have kind of that holy crap moment where you go, wow.
Right.
I didn't recognize those pieces. I didn't recognize that, that focus on knowing who I was as a person, that focus on relationship building, the fact that I was seen and heard. And even though sometimes somebody kicked my butt, like I was valued and I was there. And
Right.
yeah, it's powerful. I mean,
It
I
is
think
very
it's,
powerful.
when I have moved schools, it's always been this interesting thing about some of the things that I thought I would miss about a previous institution were not the things necessarily that I missed, because I had that moment of, wow, I didn't understand how much of, this one thing was happening until I wasn't in it. And
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't see the wood for the trees, as my grandma used to say. You know, when you're in there,
Yes,
you just can't.
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So it's not fun necessarily, Nicole, but in your mind, and you can speak about individuals if you want to. They don't have to be uh, educators. They can be. I'm talking about leaders now.
Mhm.
So, who did you have? Just talk about influences. It can be somebody you work with or for, or it could be a parent. It could have been I don't know, a famous person. Like, who were you influenced by, and why? Like, who was it, and what did they do that made you kind of stop and think, yeah, that.
Wow. That's a great question.
I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but
I would say probably three people come to mind. One of
hmm,
them was my high school debate coach, because when I started in that class, I was petrified to give up and to get up in front and give a speech. The
really,
idea of getting up and debating was like literally would almost make me want to like lose my lunch. I was sick to my stomach. I was terrified. And I remember the first day that I had to give up and give a speech in class in front of probably 15 people. It was an 8-minute speech. And he kept me up there for the entire class period.
wow,
And it was a powerful moment because he was thoughtful. He was kind. He was honest. And the tone that he set in that class was, we just kind of hold space for people to try this and to learn. And so all the rest of the students were kind of watching. I think some of them were like, so glad it's her and not me.
yeah,
And when it was over, I kind of quickly left the class, and he found me afterwards, and I just looked at him and I went, like, I don't think that I can do this. And he was someone who taught me the importance of believing in someone until you can believe in yourself. And he saw something in me that I did not see. And he just kept saying, let's do this and let's do this. And it was one of the most powerful experiences in my life, because he was not a yeller. He was not critical. He just said, why don't we try that again? Let's try it this way. And I just kept trying and kept trying, because he was right there with me.
right,
And that
right,
was, the man is just absolutely astonishing and wonderful. Another person would be the president of a school, of an organization that I served, because he was also someone who was not afraid to make difficult decisions.
right,
He trusted his team. He tackled big problems, and he tackled it by getting the best information from the best people and making the best decisions that he could, that allowed the organization to move forward, to serve the mission, and to honor the institution. And
right.
you always knew where you stood. So he was very honest.
Hmm.
Like if you were on his list because you had screwed up, you knew because he told you, but it was a closed door conversation.
Yeah.
Like it was, I mean, he was just, and there were a couple times where he shut the door and he's like, how did we get here? And I just said, we got here because of ABC. And he's like, I don't love it. This will never happen again. Here's what we're going to do. And he had my back. And
Right.
that was powerful,
Yeah.
to have someone who just led with such high integrity and supported his team. I mean, just unconditional support. Even if he hated what happened and if he disagreed, he was going to publicly back you, and you were going to have to clean up your mess
Right.
if you made it. But he was also just a visionary and incredibly thoughtful. Pretty gruff on the exterior. So I think a lot of people, he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. But in those moments where you need someone standing by your side, he was there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's super cool. That's super cool.
Yep.
Okay, so before I ask my last thing, where can people find you, Nicole?
Oh, where can people find me? Well, aside from Oregon, haha, people can find me. People can find me on LinkedIn. You can Google my name, Nicole Weyer, and you will find me there. You can also go to my website, which is Root to Rise Coaching, and learn more about who I am and the work that I do, both with schools and organizations and also one-on-one. And you can also find me on Facebook and follow me there. And you can find content around these topics of sustaining ourselves and leadership and burnout and boundaries and all of those things. So would love for people to find me there and get to know me and start a conversation.
That's fantastic. So my final thing, 3 words that describe the greatest leader you've ever encountered. And you said a few of them, but just trim it down to 3. And then we're out. I'm making you work tonight, eh?
You're making me work.
Yeah.
Human, thoughtful, dynamic.
Thank you so much, Nicole. This has been fantastic. Take care.